38 years as a labor and delivery nurse will teach you things no textbook ever could. You learn to read a room in seconds. You learn that the quietest patients are often the ones carrying the heaviest weight. You learn that a smile can be the most elaborate lie a person tells. I thought I had seen everything in those years. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. I never imagined I would spend the sharpest years of my retirement using every skill I had ever learned, not in a hospital ward in Halifax, but in my own daughter's living room, watching her disappear right in front of me. My daughter's name is Claire. She was born on a Tuesday morning in October, during the first real snowfall of the season. I remember thinking, as I held her for the first time, that she was the most certain thing I had ever touched. Everything else in my life had come with conditions, with asterisks, with fine print. Claire did not. She laughed loudly. She argued passionately. She called me every Sunday without fail from the time she left for university in Montreal until the day she moved back to Halifax at 27 to take a position at an architecture firm downtown. She was the kind of woman who made every room she entered feel more organized, more alive, more intentional. She met Daniel at a colleague's dinner party in late autumn, 3 years ago now. She called me the next morning, a Saturday, which was unusual, and she talked for 40 minutes without stopping. She said he was brilliant. She said he listened to her the way most people only pretend to. She said he had asked her 3 questions about her work and then actually remembered the answers when she brought them up again, an hour later. She laughed when she said that. She said, "Mom?" He paid attention. "Do you know how rare that is?" I did know, and I was happy for her. I met him for the first time at a Sunday dinner at my house in Bedford, about 6 weeks after they started seeing each other. He brought wine, a Niagara Riesling, which I thought was a considerate choice, and he helped me carry dishes without being asked. He asked about my nursing career with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He told Claire she looked beautiful, and when he said it, he looked at her, not at me. I noticed that. I thought it was a good sign. His name was Daniel Whitmore. He was 33 years old, originally from Oakville, Ontario. He worked in commercial real estate development. He was pleasant, he was articulate, and he made my daughter smile in a way I had not seen in years. I told my friend Ruth 2 days later that I thought he might be the one. I want you to hold that in your mind as I tell you the rest of this story. I want you to remember that I, a woman who had spent nearly 4 decades reading people for a living, looked at this man across my own dinner table and saw nothing but good things. That is how carefully it was hidden. The first thing I noticed was small enough that I almost didn't notice it at all. It was February, about 4 months into their relationship. Claire and I had plans to go to the Seaport Market on a Saturday morning, something we did every few weeks in the winter, when we needed an excuse to walk around and drink expensive coffee and pretend spring was coming. She canceled the morning of. She said Daniel had surprised her with plans and she didn't want to disappoint him. I said, of course, no problem. We'd go the following weekend. We didn't go the following weekend either. He had plans that time too. I told myself it was new relationship energy. I told myself it was February in Nova Scotia. And honestly, who could blame anyone for wanting to stay inside? By April, I had seen her 4 times since Christmas. We used to see each other at least twice a month. I mentioned this to my sister Patricia, who lives in Dartmouth, and she said I was probably just adjusting to sharing my daughter with someone new. I nodded and agreed, because it felt like the generous thing to believe. But I was a nurse for 38 years. Generous beliefs have a way of getting people hurt. In June, Daniel was offered a position with a larger development firm in Toronto. I found out not from Claire, but from a mutual friend who had seen it announced on LinkedIn. When I called Claire to congratulate her, because I assumed they had decided together and were moving, she was quiet for a moment before she said yes, They were relocating in August. She said she had meant to tell me. She said it had been a busy few weeks. I had spoken to her twice in those few weeks. She had not mentioned it either time. I drove to her apartment the next afternoon. She made tea, and we sat at her kitchen table, and I asked her directly how she was feeling about the move. She said she was excited. She said Toronto made sense for Daniel's career, and that her firm had a sister office there she could potentially transfer to. She said all of this quickly, in the way people speak when they have rehearsed an answer rather than lived it. I asked her what she wanted. Not what Daniel wanted, not what made practical sense, what she wanted. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I want him to be happy." I drove home, and I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. They moved to Toronto in August. Claire transferred to the affiliate office. They got engaged that October. He proposed at a restaurant on King Street West, and she sent me a photo of the ring before she sent it to anyone else, which made me cry in a good way, the kind of crying that comes from relief. I thought, perhaps I had been too cautious. Perhaps I had been reading patterns that weren't there. She looked radiant in that photo. She looked like herself. I flew to Toronto in November to help her look at wedding venues. It was the first time I had seen her since the move nearly 3 months. She hugged me at Pearson and held on for slightly longer than usual. I told myself it was just that we missed each other. I was good at telling myself things by then. The wedding planning began in earnest. Claire was doing most of the coordination herself, which made sense given that she worked in design and had strong opinions about aesthetics. But I noticed she checked her phone frequently during our venue appointments. I noticed that twice, after looking at her phone, she suddenly changed her preference. A hall she had loved 5 minutes earlier became too formal after a message came through. She laughed it off. I watched it happen and said nothing. The second thing I noticed happened at Christmas. Daniel's family came to Halifax for the holidays, his parents, his older sister Catherine, and Catherine's husband. We hosted a dinner at my house on the 27th. It was the first time I had spent extended time with his family, and I had been looking forward to it genuinely. Catherine was formidable in the way certain women are, when they have decided in advance that they are the most important person in the room. She was 40 years old, worked in finance in Oakville, and spoke about her professional accomplishments, the way some people recite prayers automatically, and with the expectation that others would be moved. She was not unkind to me. She was something more subtle than unkind. She was instructive. Over dinner, she commented on Claire's hair. She had cut it shorter before Christmas and said, "Daniel always loved your long hair, didn't he?" It was the kind of sentence that sounds like a compliment until you realize it isn't about Claire at all. Daniel laughed. Claire touched the back of her neck and said nothing. After dinner, I was in the kitchen with his mother, Helen, rinsing dishes. She was a quiet, pleasant woman from Burlington who seemed slightly uncomfortable in her own family, which I recognized immediately because I had seen it before in certain patients, in certain waiting rooms, the kind of discomfort that comes from years of careful self-reduction. We made small talk, and then she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "Claire reminds me of myself at that age." She said it warmly, as a compliment, but her eyes were somewhere else when she said it, and she did not elaborate. I thought about that sentence on the drive back to my house that night. I thought about it while I lay in bed. I thought about it the next morning with my coffee, looking out at the frozen Bedford Basin. I decided to pay closer attention. In January, I started calling Claire on Wednesday evenings in addition to Sundays. She answered about half the time. When she did, the calls were pleasant but brief. When I asked how work was, she said fine. When I asked how the wedding planning was going, she said Daniel had some ideas about scaling back the guest list. When I asked what she thought about that, she said it made sense, since Toronto was far for people to travel. Our original guest list had been 140 people. By February, it was 62. By March, it was 40. I called my friend Ruth, who had been married for 41 years to a man she met at Acadia University, and I described what I was observing without editorializing. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Margaret, I think you need to go to Toronto." I booked the flight the same evening. I told Claire I was coming for a long weekend to look at the final venue with her. She sounded pleased on the phone. Genuinely pleased, the kind of pleased that has relief underneath it, the kind I had learned to recognize in delivery rooms when a woman had been waiting to hear something she needed to hear. I noticed it. I filed it away. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late March. Daniel was at work. Claire picked me up from the airport and we went for lunch at a restaurant near their condo in Liberty Village. She looked well on the surface. Her clothing was nice. She had color in her cheeks. But she ate very little. I noticed her phone face down on the table throughout the meal, which was unusual for her generation, and I noticed that she flipped it over to check it 3 times in 90 minutes. We went back to the condo. It was a beautiful space, high ceilings, good light, tastefully furnished. But there was almost nothing of Claire's in it. The bookshelves held his books. The art on the walls was his taste. On the kitchen counter there was a single framed photo of the two of them, taken at what looked like a work event of his. In the entire apartment, I could not find a single object that looked like something Claire would have chosen on her own. I am a woman who has spent her life not saying the thing she is thinking at the exact moment she is thinking it. Timing in my profession is everything. I did not say anything then. I made tea, and I listened and I waited. That evening, Daniel came home from work. He greeted me warmly, shook my hand, asked about my flight. We had dinner he cooked, which he was genuinely good at. The conversation was easy and pleasant. Twice during dinner he redirected a story Claire had started telling. Not rudely, not with any obvious edge, just smoothly, the way someone changes the channel before you've finished watching. He did it so naturally that Claire barely seemed to notice, but I noticed. And I noticed that after the second time, she simply stopped telling stories for the rest of the meal. Saturday morning, Daniel left early for the gym. Claire and I had breakfast alone. I had decided the night before what I was going to do, and I had thought carefully about how to do it. I waited until she had her coffee and was settled, and then I said, "Tell me something you've done recently just because you wanted to." She looked at me. I said, "Something small is fine. Something for yourself." She thought about it for a long time. Not a pause, a genuine, extended search for an answer. Then she said, "I bought a plant for my office last month. A little pothos. I didn't ask anyone. I just bought it." She said it like it was something she had gotten away with. I put my cup down and I took her hand and I said, "Claire, I need you to talk to me." What came out over the next 2 hours was not a single dramatic revelation. It was quieter than that, and more damaging for its quietness. It was 100 small things, accumulated over 2.5 years, each one individually explainable, each one insignificant on its own. The friends in Halifax she had drifted from because Daniel found their social gatherings draining. The promotion she had been offered at work and declined because the additional hours would have been, in his words, hard on both of them. The way he spoke to her in private versus in public. The way she had started measuring her words before she said them, calculating impact and response, adjusting constantly. The way she had not painted. She was an accomplished watercolorist, something she'd done since her teens in over a year, because he had once said, absently, that the smell of the paints gave him headaches. She had put her easel in storage. She told me all of this calmly, without apparent distress, The way people describe water damage to a house they have lived in long enough that it no longer seems alarming. She had normalized all of it. That was the most frightening part. Not that it was happening, that she had stopped being able to see it clearly. I did not tell her what I thought. Not yet. I asked her one more question. I said, "Do you feel like yourself?" She looked out the window for a long time. Then she said, "I feel like a better version of myself." That's what Daniel says. I went back to my room that evening, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about Helen, Daniel's mother, who reminded Claire of herself at that age. And I understood, fully and completely, what I was looking at. I did not react. Reaction was not the tool I needed. I have a friend named Diane, not Daniel's sister, a different person entirely, a woman I worked with for 15 years in Halifax. Diane left a marriage at 52. She now runs support groups for women in the Halifax Regional Municipality through a nonprofit that partners with the Nova Scotia Department of Justice. She knows every resource, every process, every name that matters. I called her that night from the bathroom with the fan on. She listened to everything I told her. Then she said, "Margaret, what you're describing is coercive control. It doesn't require physical violence to be abuse. And it's often the most difficult kind to name, because the person living inside it has been conditioned to explain it away." I asked her what I should do. She told me to go slowly. She said the worst thing I could do was force the moment before Claire was ready to receive it. She said the goal was not to rescue her daughter. It was to make sure her daughter knew there was a door and that it would be open whenever she was ready to walk through it. I flew home to Halifax on Sunday, with a weight in my chest I had not felt since my husband passed 9 years ago. But I also flew home with a plan. Over the following weeks, I began doing something I am not proud of in terms of its formality, but would do again without hesitation. I began documenting every call with Claire. I kept notes, not recordings, just my own written record of what she said, her mood, phrases that concerned me. I reached out quietly to 2 of her closest friends from Halifax, women she had been close to for over a decade, and I was honest with them. I said I was worried. I said I thought Claire had become isolated. I asked them to reach out to her directly, without mentioning me, just to reestablish contact. They did. I also called a family lawyer I had met through a patient's family years ago, not to initiate anything, but to understand what options existed and what documentation might matter if things progressed. She was generous with her time. She told me that in Ontario, coercive control had been increasingly recognized in family court proceedings. She told me what to keep track of. I am a nurse. Documentation is a language I speak fluently. The wedding date was set for the 2nd Saturday of September. In June, 3 months before, something shifted. Claire called me on a Wednesday. She was calling more regularly by then, since I had been careful to simply be present without pressure, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had run into her friend Jess at a coffee shop near her office. Jess was one of the women I had quietly contacted. Claire said it had been really good to see her. She said they had talked for almost 2 hours. She said she had forgotten how much she laughed when she was with Jess. She said, "I don't know why I stopped seeing her so much." I said, "What do you think?" There was a pause. And in that pause I could hear something moving, something that had been stuck for a long time beginning slowly to come loose. She said, "I think I've been making myself smaller, Mom." I held the phone against my chest for a moment after she said it. Then I said, "I know. I've been watching." That was the beginning of the real conversation. It didn't happen all at once. It happened over 6 weeks, in pieces, in phone calls and a long weekend visit in July when Daniel was in Calgary for work. It happened with Jess's help, and with the help of a counselor Claire found through her employee assistance program at work, a woman named Patricia Bowes, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, because she gave Claire back her own vocabulary. In August, 6 weeks before the wedding, Claire called me on a Tuesday morning. She said she needed to tell me something. She said she had decided she couldn't marry Daniel. She said she had tried to have a conversation with him, had tried twice, actually about things she needed to change before she could commit to a marriage, and both times he had turned it around, made her feel irrational, unstable, ungrateful. She said the second time, he had told her that nobody else would understand her the way he did, that nobody else would be as patient with her. She said, "Mom, I finally heard it. I heard exactly what he was doing." She called off the engagement the following week. She did it with her counselor present by phone. Daniel was not accepting at first. He called several times. He cycled through anger and apology and a version of grief that felt more like negotiation than genuine feeling. Catherine called me directly from Oakville to tell me I had poisoned my daughter against a good man. I let her finish. Then I said, "I hope your mother is doing well," and I ended the call. The venue deposit was non-refundable, $6,000, which hurt. But the caterer returned half, and her work benefits had covered the counseling, and she had not yet changed the beneficiary on her group RRSP, which she had thought to check. She moved back to Halifax in October, into my house initially, while she looked for her apartment. She brought 3 boxes of things she had packed herself, and 1 box that had her paints in it. I had repainted the spare room the week before she came, a warm white, the color she had in her first apartment after university. I had found her easel in the corner of my basement, where it had been stored. She had left it with me before the Toronto move, and I had set it up by the window. She walked into that room and stood there for a moment without speaking. Then she turned around and hugged me, and I felt her shoulders shake. I just held on. She found a 2-bedroom apartment in the North End by November. She got a promotion at the Halifax affiliate office in February, the kind she had been offered and declined in Toronto, the kind that should have been hers already. She joined a weekly watercolor class at the Center for Art Tectonic on Tuesday evenings. She and Jess have dinner every second Thursday. She calls me on Sundays and Wednesdays, and sometimes on a random Friday afternoon just because she drove past something that reminded her of a funny story. She went for a run along the waterfront last week and sent me a voice message afterward, slightly out of breath, saying the harbor was beautiful and the light was doing something extraordinary, and she wished she had brought her sketchbook. She sounded like a woman inhabiting her own life from the inside out. She sounded like Claire. I want to say something now to whoever is listening, because I know that some of you are in this story somewhere. Not as the mother. Some of you are the daughter. Some of you have been the daughter for 5 years or 10 years or 30 years. And you have explained it to yourself the same way Claire did, with the same quiet, reasonable language, the same catalog of individual exceptions, none of which seem quite serious enough on their own to justify the weight they are collectively placing on your chest. I want you to know something that took me the better part of my career to understand fully. The absence of something obvious does not mean the absence of harm. The harm that happens slowly, in the language of love, in the grammar of care, can be the deepest kind of all. And the courage it takes to name it, even just to yourself, in a room alone, without telling anyone yet that courage is not small. That courage is enormous. That courage is the first door. If you see yourself in this story, please tell someone. Not because it will fix everything immediately, but because the moment you say it out loud to one person who is safe, it stops being only yours to carry. And things that are shared are lighter. Things that are named can be addressed. Things that are brought into the light cannot continue to survive only in the dark. My name is Margaret, and I am 61 years old, and I am a retired nurse, and I would trade every quiet Sunday I might have had for the Sunday mornings I now spend watching my daughter become herself again. Thank you for being here with me tonight. I would love to know what part of this story stayed with you, and what city are you watching from?